G'day, my name's John. I'm a tour coach driver here in Perth, Western Australia. I'm lucky. My job gets me to travel around the whole state and see lots of great things, and I'd like to show you some of them as well. So why don't you join me? Let's bathe this beach behind me, and behind that's Fisherman's Harbour. But our story starts long before any of that was ever here. You know, things have gone a little bit different a few hundred years ago. We could have been speaking French. So how did we get here? I'm glad you asked.
If you had a look at the map of WA, you'd see that there were plenty of places with Dutch or French names. Esperance, named after a French ship of 1792, has heaps of French names around its coast. And Cape Leeuwin, named after a Dutch ship. So long before the English settled here, the Dutch and the French came visiting, sometimes by choice and other times by accident, literally. The Dutch would sail to Java to collect the spices and take them back to Europe. If they can make it back, the crew could retire for the rest of their lives on their wages. That's how much the spices were worth to the Europeans. They would sail down the African coast, around the bottom and then back up, around India and on to Java in Indonesia. There were no GPSs to show them the way. Navigation was a real art form that is quickly dying out. They would follow the coastline around, so if they got in trouble, land wasn't far away. These trips could take up to 2 years or longer to complete. One day somebody worked out if they travelled further south from South Africa, they could get into what was known as the Roaring Forties. This would push them rather quickly along from the west to the east, and they could save a lot of time. But they had to time their left turn correctly. Now, if they timed their left turn correctly, they would get up into what was known as the Leeuwin Currents, which run from the bottom of Western Australia up to about Broome, which would push them really quickly up to Java. And if they got out of the winds too early, they'd lose time from what they've gained. If they timed it too late, they would run into the reefs off the West Australian coast. And probably the most famous one is the Titanic of the 17th century, the Batavia, on its maiden voyage with its mutiny and murder. But that's another story. There were a lot of mapping expeditions, and at one point the English were going down one coast and the French were going down the other. They met somewhere in the Aussie Bight, and even though at home they were fighting the Napoleonic Wars, these two sailors got together and compared maps before going their separate ways.
This is where the Dutch explorer William de Vlaming came ashore. He walked up over the hill in the back here and saw the river. So he paddled up the river with his boat and saw all the black swans and named it the Black Swan River. We just shortened it down to the Swan River. Back then, the Dutch and the French weren't really interested in conquering land. What they were looking for were trading partners, but didn't find anything of interest here, so they just left. So jump forward a couple of hundred years. The English had already set up camp on the east coast in a couple of places when they heard that now maybe the French were interested in conquering this land. Now, while the English didn't know if they wanted it, one thing they did know is they didn't want the French to have it.
So very quickly they got a boat together and a few settlers and a handful of convicts, sailed around the bottom of Australia to a little place on the south coast that was known to have a great natural harbour. And they arrived on Christmas Day 1826. We now call that place Albany. This is a replica of the brig Amity, which was the boat that arrived on that day. Can you imagine sailing off in something that small and crowded with people and animals to some place you never heard of and knowing there is nothing there when you arrive?
In 1827, Captain James Stirling considered the Swan River area suitable for British settlement and returned to London to report that. In the meantime, as the story goes, the French arrived, saw the English flag, then sailed off over the horizon. Always made me wonder why, when the French got here and they saw the flag, why didn't they just throw it under a tree and then put their flag up and call it for France? Or just go 200 metres up the beach and do the same thing.
2 years later, in 1829, Captain Fremantle hoisted the Union flag in a bay in accordance with his instructions. He took formal possession of the whole of the west coast of New Holland in the name of Britain's King George IV. Back in England, they promoted this land as a wonderful place with wide open plains and fertile soils. So farmers, shopkeepers and the like packed up their wives, kids, maids, mistresses and grand pianos, loaded them on the ships and set sail for a better life. When they got here, what do you think they saw? The great Australian bush. So Fremantle was the first settlement. Stirling went in his boat up the river exploring, looking for better soils to grow food for the settlers. As the river opened out into this wide area, Stirling thought it would make a great administrative centre for the Swan River colony, as it would be known. So he stuck his flag in the ground and called it Perth, after Perth in Scotland.
So they paddled their boats up the river here and found this really fertile land just at the base of the hills, and this was going to be the farming area, and they called the spot Guildford. Not long after the farmers moved in, the grape growers moved along behind and pushed the farmers even further out. We now know this area as the Swan Valley.
So Fremantle was going to be the port, Perth the administrative centre, and Guildford the farming area for the colony.
Now the English looked at the hills over here and they wondered what was on the other side. Problem was, the river went north and they wanted to go east. So they left their boats here and walked up over the top of the hills, came down the other side, thought it looked a lot like Yorkshire in England, so they called that spot York. And all this happened within the first 12 months of the settlers arriving, and that was the year 1829.
Over the next 20 years or so, more settlers arrived and they were really struggling. So the government of the day sent a letter back to England asking for convicts. Remember, he had farmers and shopkeepers. What he needed were people that could build things like roads and buildings.
After a lot of negotiations between the English government, the local government and the settlers, an agreement was made on what type of convicts would be sent out. The locals didn't want to have the place turned into a convict settlement. So if you murdered somebody and you didn't have a trade, you'd stay in England. Or if you stole a loaf of bread or a piece of material and you had a trade, you were a builder or a tradesman, you'd be coming out on the next boat to WA. The next problem is, the boat that had the letter on it saying that they were going to get their convicts arrived 6 months after the boat arrived with the convicts. So can you imagine that morning when they looked out over the horizon and saw a boat coming and thought, geez, I wonder what they're bringing us. And when they arrived, the captain gets off the boat and he says, "G'day, how you going? I've got your convicts." And they probably said, what convicts? The convicts were held in a warehouse where the Esplanade Hotel is now located. From here every morning they would be marched up to a limestone hill over the back, where they would then have to build their own prison.
From then, the colony never looked back. And basically, that's how it all began.
There's lots of interesting and amazing stories from around here at that time of the struggles to survive, and quite frankly most of us probably wouldn't survive it. They really were a tough lot back then. If they weren't, they died.